Bonjour,
Bonjour.
je vais demander à tous les intervenants d'éteindre leur micro. Merci à tous d'être présents pour assister à ce side event qui consistera en une présentation suivie de partage d'expertise sur la Tunisie
Thank you
et sur
very
le Maroc.
much for having accepted to attend to the side event. And of course, we want to contribute by offering two languages, French and English. So we are going to see that this meeting has been organized by the ECPM. And so the idea is to study the various processes of the state members, abolition of the death penalty. I would like to thank Mr. Nail Georges, who is an author of the study published by the ECPM, Choukri Latif, who is the Tunisian Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and Abderrahim Jamai, who is working for the Moroccan Coalition Against the Death Penalty. I would also like to thank Mohamed, who is the president of Damas, who has in fact accepted to write the introduction. So of course we are organizing this virtually because of the health crisis. We are the widest international, so 57 state members, out of which 22 in the Islamic states, 2% in Europe, 47% in Africa, 47% in Pacific Asia. Now, after having worked for 20 years against the death penalty, we wanted to publish some articles to see that this universal rights also concerns the various players in the states that had not abolished, and they're also going to advocate. Now, in order to better understand the mechanisms that, of course, led the various states to this process of abolition, we will talk about the various roles. This work, of course, is done by international but also national players and also advocates for human rights. So the idea is to reinforce the various actions. Considering the various argumentations and the discussions around the death penalty abolition, it also concerns the penal right in the Islamic states, and the idea is to, of course, reinforce the application. Out of the 57 OIC, 7 have abolished. 3 have abolished for common rights, ordinary crimes, and 2 have had a long history, over 60 years, other in 20 years. Mauritania, Algeria, Morocco are examples. 24 states are retentionist states. So therefore, a minority of states have started working on that. In 2018, 14 states have voted against the abolition of death penalty. Now, as part of the Universal Periodic Review, we have accepted only 288 out of over 1,000. Over 63 recommendations that came from state members, 45 have been accepted, out of which 20 have been sent to the OIC. All these states, whether they are moratorium states or abolished states, so of course they have positioned themselves in favor. You will see that Mohamed Bejawi, former Minister of the Foreign Affairs, had declared that the death penalty is not effective. It doesn't help the victims. It doesn't help the people. And this is also the case in Egypt because Mohamed al-Baradal, former president and also defender of the human rights, has said that this death penalty is not reversible. So I will give the floor to Nael Georges, who will present his study and his presentation. Thank you very much, Julia. So as you know, the processes of abolition for death penalty in the member states, and the OIC has, of course, been organized before the meeting in 2011. Firstly, I'd like to thank ECPM. Julia also have cooperated for the study, so thank you very much. In fact, the main objective of this study is to fight against death penalty in the world and also promote the abolition. So therefore, we really focused on several states. A big number of these states continue to apply death penalty. In order to better understand, as Julia has said, we really worked on the various processes that led to the abolition of some states. And therefore, we want to suggest a kind of process so that they could abolish the death penalty in their own state. So therefore, we wanted to really look at the different phases, including the legal, legislative, and also the role of the various players, national authorities, institution, parliament members, and also the different advocates for human rights. This work was started in March 2020, just after the COVID crisis. And for this study, we wanted to visit to the Human Rights Council in Geneva in order to meet the delegations of the various member states of the OIC. I was able to speak, but all the side events and other meetings were really canceled or postponed. So it was more difficult to find people in order to discuss, and it made it very complicated in order to move forward with the information. Now, despite these difficulties, I was able to discuss with some state members. In some studies, some were very reluctant, and that was the case with Turkey. They abolished, but also the political situation is very much mixed. So at the same time, as Julia and Nicolas, we worked. We therefore set up a questionnaire in different languages in order to collect the different information for our studies. This questionnaire was sent to all the delegations of the concerned states. So you had the foreign ministries or even delegations in Geneva. But we also tried to contain some state representatives within the Justice Ministry. We also sent this questionnaires to the various human rights association, and some gave us back the questionnaire, and the information was extremely useful in order to continue the study. And then I, in fact, carried out various researches in French, Arabic, English, and I found information in what we call the periodic reviews sent to the states, that is to say, the Human Rights Committee and other committees. And here you have the list on the questions that are formulated by the committees to these states. There's also the national legislation that will give us some information. This is done in the local language. And then we also had to look at the position of these state members during the General Assembly of the UN, calling for moratorium on death penalty, not just the last meeting, but also we wanted to see what was the evolution of the position of these states. As you can see, the study is divided into two parts. The first part is called OIC and death penalty. The second one was a case study of some member states of the OIC, and we tried to find some states with minority and majority states, Muslim and Muslim minority and Muslim majority. Now, for the first part, I really focused on the question of religion. As you all know, Islam plays a very big role to respect human rights, but also for violation of the human rights. So it really depends on the interpretation of the Sharia, and not just the violation of human rights, but also talking about the abolition of death penalty or maintaining that death penalty. So Islam is a political strength that is extremely big, especially if we look at the Arabic states and members of the OIC. Islam is part of the institution as a state religion in most constitution, and also Sharia, Islamic law, is also sometimes a main source of the legislation. So therefore, the governments of various states continue to say today that if we abolish the death penalty, it would be going against the Sharia, Islam, and therefore it goes against the tradition of the countries. And at the same time, the capital death penalty is also against these that really have the rights of freedom of speech and freedom of life. And this slide really shows the position of different Islamic states. And they say there is no religious consensus within the Islam or the application of death penalty. Here you have a map. Maybe you read the introduction of Dr. Hama, who said that there is an argument against the application of the death penalty. And as Julia said, within the OIC member states, there are only 4 that will maintain a moratorium, 20 have abolished. So therefore, we can say that most of the states, so 61 member states, no longer apply the death penalty today. What else can we say? There are different, I would say, conditions. It could be also applied on Jews and Christians, and they say that in most of the states, this is no longer a pledge. So how do we interpret, and also the Islamic rights? I think it's very important, and I think it's the starting point if we want to abolish the death penalty. And the second part, as I said, we really focused on case studies. And what did we see? We see that there's a wide difference regarding the abolition of the death penalty from one state to another. So several states have been studied, and we saw that the parliament members and civil societies or political representatives, they played a very strong role. And also international pressure is very strong, and the wish of some states to really show a very respectable image when it comes to democracy and human rights. And again, this was a major plus and advantage for the abolition. And also other states, especially during international conferences within the UN or Europe, some states, for example, said that they promised the abolition, and also the fact that they would sign a protocol related to the International Act on Civil Rights. So there is this promise, and this promise has been kept, and so they really accepted the protocol, and then they abolished the death penalty. So that was really the case of some African countries where there's a sacred, I would say, belief in life, and that really played a major role in the abolition. Then, in terms of legislation, they modified the legislation in order to abolish in Benin. For example, the Institutional Court has played a major role. They decided to modify all of the penal codes and military codes that was not in favor of the abolition. What else can I add? As a conclusion, it's always important to continue to support the Islamic movements that are in these states in order to encourage not only human rights, but also the abolition. Now, these integrists, they are also sometimes victims of violation. For example, Ahmad Mahmoud Bara in Sudan, who was in fact sentenced in 1995 only because he moderately interpreted the Islam, and others have also been imprisoned. So I think that freedom of expression, freedom of religion, democracy, the right to choose your religion, I think that are all these items to really encourage abolition.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now give the floor to Mr. Latif. Yes. Thank you. I think that there's a translation because I'm going to speak in Arabic. No, not Arabic. In French, please. There's a translation, but French and English. So all these presentations have to be given in French. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know, says the speaker. He saw that there was translation, but he didn't realize that it was only French and in English. I thought that I could speak Arabic. No, please don't speak in Arabic. In any case, I'd like to thank our friends at the World Coalition, at the ECPM. Thanks for organizing this side event and also talking about the human rights and also death penalty in Tunisia. I would also like to thank all this work with the OIC countries. Now, my comments on this study, if there's no consistency, if all these countries altogether are not consistent within this OIC, there's nothing homogeneous regarding the cultures, whether it's the social culture, if there are discrepancies between these political systems. For example, we know that some countries have a political system which is maybe more republican, or monarchy, or divine rights. Some countries have presidents or parliament members. So these countries are too varied, and therefore that's a fact. So that's my first comment. And then the Arabic countries, who are, I would say, in theory, the core of Muslim religion, and they could be a kind of center. All these countries are not part of the list of the countries that have abolished the death penalty, and I think that's a very important point to underline. Another comment, which I find essential, what is going on in these countries, in the African continent, or even in Asia, this all goes to show that the former Eurocentric vision is no longer valid, and therefore there's a real momentum, something that is moving forward and towards human rights respect and towards the abolition of death penalty, again, beyond this former European vision. Now, when it comes to Tunisia, and since 1991, they have observed a moratorium, but this moratorium has never been really formalized, and as a result, the situation is very fragile. And the recent elections in October 2019 maybe could jeopardize this moratorium because the new president, elected member president, has said that he was in favor of death penalty. Now, there's also a lack of official data, number of death penalties in the world, and so therefore it's very difficult to apply. In addition, the courts continue to sentence more and more capital punishment. Now, when it comes the prisoners, the conditions have been, of course, worsened since the revolution in Tunisia, and even more after the COVID-19 pandemic. Why? Because the prisons are full of prisoners, and therefore they don't have the budget. For example, in Tunisia, they are part of various international conventions. All this mechanism was put in and applied in 2016. And what's important is that Tunisia constantly votes in favor of the resolution of the UN and calling for a moratorium on death penalty application. And this has been the case since 2012. We were extremely eager to see what was the last vote because the president, who, as I said, is in favor of death penalty, it was a time of wait to see if Tunisia was going to, yes or no, maintain the moratorium. And formally, thanks to the mobilization of our coalition, we saw that the president has voted in order to maintain the moratorium. And this is extremely important for our advocacy work and also for the future. Now, this being said, we are extremely concerned when we look at what the conditions are for the prisoners accused of terrorism or terrorist acts. So we continue to fight these practices, and we're also against the application of death penalty, or rather the sentences in Tunisia. It's always part of a discrimination because most of these sentenced people are vulnerable people. They are poor people. They don't have the possibility of having a lawyer during their with the defense. So to sum up, I would say that the abolition in Tunisia against death penalty, we are continuing to fight in order to secure not only the moratorium, but why not become an abolitionist state, continuing and also to validate and sign the international agreements on human rights and political rights. In the meantime, we are, of course, calling the authorities to really only limit the sentences only to the very serious crimes, and why not work on different legislations. And we also encourage the authorities to completely review their legal code and penal code. So to conclude, I'd like to say that the situation in Tunisia, compared to the other Arabic states, we can say that it is quite advanced or modern. And we know that the history of Tunisia since 19th century is a history that is going towards the respect of human rights by defending. And as you know, Tunisia was the first Muslim country to really apply and vote for a constitution. And it was also the first country in 1846 to abolish slavery. And Tunisia was also the first country to abolish polygamy. And then in 2010, 2011, Tunisia was the first country to, in fact, remove. And we would like to, of course, that this work will continue. So no dictatorship, and we want Tunisia to have a positive role and in the end completely abolish death penalty. And again, this moratorium stage could be just a temporary stage. And as you know, we are celebrating the 30th anniversary this year. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Shukri, for this presentation. Very interesting. If I could just go back on the question on the ratification of the protocol, the International Pact on the Civil Rights. So, as you know, 14 member states have ratified it. I will now hand it over to Abderrahim Jamai, who's in charge of the Moroccan Coalition Against the Death Penalty. Thank you very much, Julia. And thanks for having invited me to this side event with our friends, Nail Georges, Chokri Latif. So I'd like to thank for him for all these studies and a very professional and serious study. So as you know, this subject is always a hot subject, especially during the conferences between abolitionist countries. It's a subject that really concerns society and all these facets, but also the origins of this subject is a political subject. That is to say, when we look at religion, religion as a reference for society has also a reference to history, but also legal at the same time. And I know that in a lot of countries where we have these Islamic states, I would say that this is a subject that has always been there. And there's always different ideas, different behaviors and reactions. And unfortunately, some reactions are going towards repression, imprisonment, or death. And that is why these kind of subjects, I think that this organization, our organization, is going to try to fight this and maybe help and promote the mindsets, which is always a tricky subject when we speak of abolition. So firstly, I'd like to congratulate Niall for his study, but I have, I have comments I'd like to share with our friend Mr. George and also Julia and all the participants. The first thing, and as our Shokri has said, is that when we speak of Islamic states, it's not the same as European states. It's more, when we speak of Islamic states, we speak of states that have their legal, I would say, it's not a joint international reference or legal reference. It's more religion. That is to say, Islam is the religion of the states. But within these states, they go even further and they forbid, when it comes to legal text, they say that we cannot rule out the Muslim religion when we speak of constitution. When we look at Sudan, Mauritania, and other countries, of course, Iran and other countries, Iraq, and so on. What do we see? We see that there is what we call a constitutional ban for the legislator to add sources that are known by history, ancient history and modern history. And I'm speaking of human rights law fixed by international justice or other international associations. So I would say that this situation means that we have tremendous difficulties when we start discussing on Islam and death. So we have enormous difficulties. And of course, it means that those countries that are, I would say, more open, moderate Islamist or laicism for half and Muslim for half, and so it's always difficult. Some people want to, in fact, when we say, okay, half Muslim and half laicism, so that means that we're always using religion. And this is not positive. And sometimes they use this as an opportunity. So again, these trends to have this reference even within Islamic states. So this means that it exists, this organization of countries, whether they are, for example, in Morocco, and they do not refer to this legislation only of Sharia. For example, the Moroccan constitution, when it talks about state, when it talks about religion, they speak of the Islamic law. The political regime in Morocco is Islam, but all the cultures of various religion, including the international dimensions of human rights. I think we have to take this into consideration. Now, the second comment, the second factor, and I don't know why Naël Georges did not take this into account. You might remember that Morocco has taken place in one of the discussions, but I don't know why we didn't call other people, men and women, to take part. That is to say, to present the vision of other organizations of, for example, lake states or lake, so that they can have a view, and maybe in Islam countries and the penal justice in Islam, within the Islam. And I think that we could have really gone further, or rather opened this avenue. And I think this would have brought, I would say, additional information. So I think that is important. So why have we seen in all this Iraq, Egypt, and other countries, and Iran, and other countries, and other countries who are in the first line? So what is the question? Is there a problem of religion, or rather an formal application of a religion, a stricto application of the culture? I'd say that there is no strict application that is given by the Quran and what we call Sunnah of the Prophet and so on. because shuna is what? Suna. Suna is what? It's a behavior of someone who was called the Prophet Muhammad, or solutions that are inspired by Quran, but also inspired by society at that time, 14 centuries ago. It's not just only inspired from religion, but also inspired from a society. The behaviors of men and women in society, of those who were really having power of money, power of economy, and that was the sovereigning power at the time. So the prophet was obliged to give explanation, to really encourage people to live together and also give these directives, either based on the principles from the Quran or what we call a political intelligence, if you like, so that in society people could live together happily and there's no conflict and more in the society. And that is why I said, and I wanted to really leave the discussion open, of course. And that's why I said, in the current situation, we cannot say that the application of the Sharia was the only item that exists to make sure that this country does not abolish a death penalty. I think that we have to consider that there's also a clear item, which is a system, which is politics. When we speak of these countries that have a strategy to really solve conflicts within the society, and also an approach of justice, an approach of equality and application of laws within the society. And this can also tell and say that in the end, we need to take into account not only the culture, but also the differences within a society and the situation of women and children in a society, and also the situation of those who take power in these societies.